Hey everyone, I'm back and very excited to be talking about Joel Best's Chapter 2, Soft Facts, or Sources of Bad Statistics. This is a really valuable chapter for us. It's one of the reasons I like the Best reading so much. We are doing mostly Whelan, but we do a few chapters from Best, and this is one of the great ones. This is where we talk about, we've already explained how statistics are socially created, not just describing social phenomena, but we think that somehow because it's a number, it must be more real somehow than something that's not a number. But uh, we we really get into how social statistics are a function not just of the thing we're trying to measure, but also how we define the thing we're trying to measure, how we measure it itself, and some problems with how we go about it, including sampling and guessing. So let's get into it without further ado. I've got a presentation ready to go for us here. And get my head out of the way. There we go. All right. So Best has these four INGs, these guessing, measuring, defining, and sampling. And we do each of them, we see each of them, lots and lots of examples of these four ing problems with misdefining or misdirecting social statistics going on with respect to coronavirus and related issues around coronavirus today. One of the things we do first and foremost when we don't know a figure is we guess. We just make something up. And sometimes known as a WAG, a wild ass guess. The times that we do this in particular is when there's a dark figure. A dark figure is the thing that we don't know that is either unknowable or really difficult to know or uncountable, or just we haven't collected data on it yet. So it's unknown, right? And then interest groups get involved and they try and say, well, that guess is too high and this is why, or that guess is too low and this is why. We saw this going on with coronavirus in a major way at the start of the outbreak in the United States. We've also seen a lot of accusations of misinformation or disinformation against the Chinese government going on. I don't know what's going on in China, but I think it's an interesting illustration of this this attempts to inflate or deflate the guess. And so you'll see people on social media, people on sort of bloggy, news-ish kind of sites arguing that there's actually hundreds of thousands of new cases in China, arguing that there's hundreds of thousands of deaths in China. But if the Chinese government isn't producing figures, then we don't know, right? So maybe they're keeping tabs on the numbers and they're covering it up, right? But it's not a leaked document. It's a guess. So it's a good example of this thing we're talking about, where do we know how many people really have this condition or this disease or have been dying from it? And if the answer is no, we don't really know, then people are oftentimes resort to guesses. Best makes the point that guesses sometimes take on a life of their own. So a guess ends up being repeated so often that it becomes commonly assumed to be a real figure, when in fact it was something that somebody just made up. I want to take one more minute to talk about something in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. A guess is different than an estimate, because a guess is just saying 100 million or a billion or 1112, right? It's just a guess. An estimate has a large degree of uncertainty with it, or could have a large degree of uncertainty, but an estimate is informed by known factors, by parameters. And so when you make an estimate, you say, here's what I believe to be the case, here are the conditions in which I believe this to happen, these are the conditions I expect to see going forward. Based on those assumptions, I would expect this, right? And so, for example, when scientists were estimating how long the coronavirus was in Washington before it had been spreading, they used genetic evidence to say that it had been around for 6 weeks. And from that, they made an estimate of around how many people would have caught it on the assumptions of how easy it was to catch the virus compared to some other common coronaviruses. And it's based on some other data. So it wasn't just sort of, it could be 1 million, could be 2, we don't know. It was, well, we think it's here, we think it's being spread in the community, and our best estimate. You see the difference there? It's not, well, we just don't know, it could be anything. It's, well, if it's being spread like the flu or being spread like a cold, it could be as high as this number, right? And I don't remember what the estimates were, but that's where these estimates come from, and they're different than guesses. I wanted to take a minute to point that out. All right, moving on to defining. So we talked about guessing as a problem when we don't know anything, especially the dark figure. Dark figure, by the way, is things sometimes dark figures, things that are hard to count because people don't want to admit to them, right? So there's a dark figure for how many people cheat on their taxes. Because if you ask the IRS how many people cheat on their taxes, they won't know. They only know how many people they catch cheating on their taxes, right? And so when we get into defining now, it's a little bit different because we are measuring things instead of just guessing at them. But the way we define a problem affects the things that we count as part of the problem or not part of the problem. So you're dead or you're not seems really clear, but maybe some of you, as soon as I say that, are like, but wait a minute. And yes, there are cases where whether someone's actually dead or not is a medical ethics problem, right? Where there's somebody whose body is on life support and they are medically brain dead, and is that person alive or not is a case of medical ethics. And whether if their family wants to disconnect them from life support, can the family do that, right? Is that killing someone if their brain doesn't show any activity? So even something as seemingly clear-cut as dead or not might have some edge cases of definition problems of how do we decide someone's actually dead or not. But even more importantly, there's lots of cases where there's social issues where we're not quite clear on what the definition is, and we have to decide what our definition is going to be. The example we focus on this week in particular is homelessness, and so there's a couple readings up in the module now for homelessness. And the question is, what counts as homeless? Is somebody who lives in an RV homeless? Well, the way I said that, most of you probably say yes. But then if we talk about my nephew's grandparents who live in an RV and drive from Arizona up to Washington State every summer, and they're retired, then your answer might be, no, they're not homeless, right? So the definition can matter, and most people extend homelessness to people who aren't just sleeping on the streets. But how about this? If someone is sleeping in a temporary homeless shelter, they're not sleeping on the streets. So do they count as homeless or not? The answer usually is yes. But exactly how broadly we define homelessness, so do we count somebody who's crashing on a friend's couch that otherwise wouldn't have a place to stay? Most definitions of homelessness don't include that individual, even though they are really insecure, right? If you're counting on your friends to put you up or else you don't have a home, that's pretty insecure. But couch surfing doesn't count as homeless by most definitions. And so if we draw the definition too narrowly, then we end up missing some people or some cases that we maybe should have counted. And so that's called a false negative when we miss somebody, right? That should have been counted. If we draw the definition too broad, if we count everything from here to here, then we end up with false positives where we count too many cases. So we count somebody on a sleepover as homeless when in fact they're just visiting a friend, right? And that was maybe seemed like a trivial example, but this sort of thing happens statistically sometimes. One more example of this, and it's an unpleasant topic, so I apologize in advance for bringing it up, but the era of Me Too and Harvey Weinstein's prosecution in particular brought this to light, where the idea of what counts as sexual assault and what counts as rape is really coming under close scrutiny today, because what a lot of people have decided, and what the courts have decided now, it appears as well, is that, well, this is a little different. I'm not going to say the courts have decided it. The courts sided against, with the accusers and with the prosecution against Weinstein But the question of some of the stuff that Weinstein did, which was super gross and super offensive, and to most people sounds like assault, sexual assault, didn't count under most laws as sexual assault. And so I don't want to get into more description than that because it's just gross. But this is this problem of false negatives, right? Which is that the narrow definition of sexual assault involves one person touching another, and so a lot of the things that Weinstein was credibly accused of doing were only prosecutable as depending on the state code. I think one was indecent liberties and one was indecent exposure kind of thing, right? So like a I don't think either one of those was a felony. And this is where we sort of end up with this problem of definitions. If we end up being too broad, then everything counts, right? Now, by the way, people who mostly grumpy people online, but some people managed to go on the record for this at the time. There was a little bit of a backlash, especially from older men about this, which was, well, this Me Too thing, you're just supposed to believe women. I'm not saying this. I'm just paraphrasing some of the arguments I've heard, just to be clear. But there was this argument from some corners of the interwebs in particular that creating such a broad definition of sexual harassment under Me Too meant that men couldn't ask women out for dates anymore. Right? And so their argument, so again, personally, I don't think this is a really a credible claim. This is just me. You can agree to disagree you can disagree with me if you want, right? But the argument was fundamentally one of Me Too creating false positives, which is that a man complimenting a woman was going to be seen as harassment because the definition of harassment had been so construed so broadly. So that's one of these cases, right? Where debate exists over exactly where the definition is drawn. So these are all problems with defining. I actually want to take one more thing and talk about this, and this again is unpleasant stuff, but we talked earlier about problems with measuring. The first chapter in Best was about measuring domestic violence. And one of the questions he had was, well, if the police come but then don't arrest anyone, does it count? Does it go into the statistical books as a case of domestic violence? We have a really difficult time counting domestic violence and measuring it because of its definitions, because definitions of domestic violence vary from state to state, but we've also seen a changing degree of definition over time. And so I don't want to put a definite date on this, but 50 years ago, or definitely 100 years ago, it was far more socially acceptable, still unacceptable, far more socially acceptable for a husband to hit his wife. And I hope everyone agrees now that's completely unacceptable. But the idea of changing social norms, changing mores, means that we have changed our definition of what the thing is, right? So what counts as sexual harassment in my earlier, or sexual assault in my earlier example, and what counts as domestic violence in this current example changes from time to time, and the broadening of the definition means we have more cases. So this is an interesting question to ask. Does an increase of the thing that we're measuring mean the thing is increasing, or does it mean our definition is changing? That's an interesting question to ask. It's a difficult problem at times, right? All right. The third ing, measuring. Now, once we have a definition agreed on, and people might not agree on your definition, but if you can defend it, then fine. It's good enough, right? Once we have a definition agreed on, we're going to count things that fall within this range. So sleeping on the street is definitely homeless. Sleeping in a shelter is definitely homeless. Sleeping on a friend's couch and not having a place to stay is definitely homeless. Sleeping in an RV or a car is homeless. All those things count, right? Now we have to go and measure that. And measure, we have a clear definition, but how do we find the homeless? That's really hard, right? Homeless people are deliberately trying not to be found because they're homeless. They're out sleeping in the woods or under a bridge or in a doorway or at a friend's house, right? In a car, trying not to be observed. How do we count that many people? That's a problem of measurement with the definition we've already established. One of the ways we can do measurement is by asking people, right? So finding the people to ask them, are you homeless? That's a challenge, right? But also we have problems with measurement that goes beyond that. So we can get different answers for a similar question based on the way we've worded it. If we're really pernicious, if we're a bad actor, we can actually get the answers more the way we want by slanting the question to bias people's answers. Like, don't you agree that, right? If I ask you a question, don't you agree that, then you're more likely to agree with me if you're on the sort of mushy middle about that, right? Furthermore, the same survey results can be interpreted differently by different people. We just saw an example of that with the How Politics Makes Us Stupid reading, right? And then sometimes the measurement decisions that we make are hidden from us. So in other words, we don't know when we see the results of a study, if someone's presenting it as a persuasive tool, not as a academic tool, sometimes they will present only the findings that they think will support their cause, and they'll conveniently leave out a few of the other less compelling findings that they have. Here's an example of question effects. You're asking a population in 1996, and this is a representative sample of the American public. Do you favor a woman having access to legal abortions? And then ... If the woman's own health is seriously endangered, then 92% of the public said yes in that case. But then the more the less life-threatening and the more a matter of seeming convenience we make it, then the less public support there was for it in 1996. By the way, this is one of the statistics that hasn't seen much change in terms of public opinion. There's still a big divide about support for access to abortions in the United States in general. This is still a very divisive issue. And it's interesting because there's a lot of social issues that we've seen dramatic change since the 1990s on. For example, acceptance of LGBTQ related issues like gay marriage. So it's just a side note, but it's an interesting case of these question effects, right? Now, by the way, this is an example of question wording from BEST. Somebody could come back and say, well, those things are different, and it's a fair enough point, right? But the way you ask the question or the kind of question you ask can affect the answer you get. That's the larger point he's trying to make. Last but not least, Ing, is problems with sampling. Now, sampling is when you want to find out about a large population, say 1 million, 6 million, 40 million people in California, 330 million people in the United States. You want to find out about all those millions of people, but you can't ask all of them. You can't count all of them. You can't measure all of them. We try and do that every 10 years with the census, but even then it's really hard. And so you want to sample them. So you have to ask 1,000 of them, and that can work. If you have a truly random sample of sufficient size, and it's amazingly small. You can know a lot about 1 million people by sampling randomly 1,000 of them. We'll talk about why that is true more in chapters 9 and 10. Do not worry, it's coming. But we can do a lot to make the sample non-random. We can do different polling. All kinds of polling errors or sampling errors can end up skewing the sample so that it doesn't actually represent the larger population. This part of BEST is the least immediately relevant to us, but we are going to come back to it when we talk about polling in chapter 10 in particular of Whelan. And it'll be something to keep in mind when we talk about different forms of bias when we get into sources of good statistics and bad statistics later on. So something to keep in mind. All right. So what is it that makes good statistical data good data? So because this is all about sources of bad facts, right, or bad statistics. so to flip that around and say, okay, what is it we want? If we want to have good statistics, we want to have more than a guess. So estimates are okay. If we have an estimate, we want to acknowledge how uncertain it is, right? Which is, well, we don't know enough about what we don't know to know even what our assumptions are. Then that's just a guess, right? But if we have assumptions, we can say the assumptions. Then, hey, state your assumptions and make your estimate. So more than guessing, we need to have some kind of source for our information or a credible belief in what we know about the world. Clear and reasonable definitions. Now, again, clear and reasonable is in the eye of the beholder, and so my idea of clear and reasonable might not be your idea of clear and reasonable. That's always going to happen. The same thing for measurement, right? So if I go out and I establish a protocol for counting homeless people, and yet you're convinced there's more homeless people than the ones I counted, then you'll criticize my measurement strategy. You'll say you didn't look carefully enough, or you didn't look under the bridges, or you didn't look in the woods, or they were hiding from you, or they don't like you. There's all kinds of ways to attack definitions and measures, but we'll get to that in a minute. Last but not least, a good sample, which means that you were careful to avoid bias or sampling bias or selection bias in the creation of your sample. But if we have a clear and reasonable definition, it might be clear and reasonable only in the eye of the beholder. But the last point here is the important one about that, which is if we know how whatever the statistic was defined. In other words, if the definition is given as a clear one, and so even if we don't agree it's clear and reasonable, we can say, well, this is the definition. At least you told me what it was, right? And how it was measured and how it was sampled. Then we have an idea about where the statistic is coming from and what possible limitations it might have, right? So we might say, wow, that definition is really narrow. I bet you there's more cases that you didn't count. Or, wow, that measurement isn't going to be effective at getting people to answer, or it's going to bias people's answers this way, so it might be bigger or it might be smaller, right? But knowing the source of the statistic in terms of definitions and measures or sampling plans is really important. If you don't know where a stat came from, don't trust it, because you don't know where it came from, right? So a couple really quick examples of this, and I've already talked about these briefly, so we don't spend much time, right? But the Economist reading that we did is about how do we count homeless, and so rough sleepers obviously count, right? But there's people who count as statutory homeless who might be sleeping at a friend's house, might be crashed with their parents' house, but not like living permanently with their parents. How do we count that? How do we? So first of all, if we count it, if we include that in the definition, fine. But then how do we measure it? This is a really big challenge, right? And then the Arnold article I found really interesting because it tried to give a little bit different take on these statistics, which is it made the number of homeless people as a proportion of. And so Baltimore was 1 in 150, New York was 1 in 160, Detroit was 1 in 225, New Orleans was 1 in 54 people was homeless, right? So it's an interesting metric, interesting way to put the homelessness problem in these cities in perspective. I thought it was a nice little it's not data explainer, if you will. Last but not least is this slide from the Seattle Times, which shows different ways of counting homelessness, not in terms of actually counting the homeless population, but rate per 10,000 residents up there in the, where are we? Yeah. My finger, way up there. And then over here, where are we? Nope, over here. Right there. Not used to this head thing. So right here we have by state rate per 10,000 residents. Right here by metro, where are we? Right there, rate per 10,000 residents by metro area. Notice there's differences in even the top 10 that are even included, right, based on how you count it. The bottom left corner over there is by percent of homeless sleeping outside. And then the one right here under my head, let me get my head out of the way, is by number of people in homelessness. So total absolute number, you notice that Seattle King County is top 3 if we count absolute number, right? So all these different ways of measuring the same thing give us a different ranking based on how we count it. So that's another dimension of this. Which one is top 3, which one is top 5, which one is even on the map. Notice that some cities, Texas doesn't have any homeless people on the 3 maps except for the bottom left, where it's got number 6, number 7, number 10 by percent of the homeless sleeping outside, presumably because the weather is nicer and people don't have to find a place to shelter indoors to stay alive. But just another way of slicing the population here to make a different graphical claim. All right, I think I have one more article to talk about, and I brought this up already. Yeah, I did. So there's those 2 articles about homelessness. Here's an example about the dark figure. That is the number of things that we have not been counting or don't know about. And this is a really challenging thing to think about, but New York City has been tabulating deaths related to coronavirus. And by the way, one of the definitions here that's been challenged by people who want coronavirus to be a smaller thing than it is and want coronavirus to not be taken as seriously as it is and want, in particular, the economy to open up faster than it is. So people who are on the side of the issue discounting the impact of coronavirus or are arguing that it's being inflated more than it should be, are really critical right now of New York's policy, and this is actually a national policy. If someone dies and they're given a coronavirus test, and or if someone dies while they're infected with coronavirus, then their cause of death counts as coronavirus related, and so it counts into the coronavirus death toll. Now, some people are really mad about that because they're like, well, but they were going to die anyway. And I mean, I guess so, right? So yeah, technically, if you had coronavirus, but were crossing the street and were hit by a bus, did coronavirus kill you? No, honestly, it did not, right? But the point of this is that we're talking about this definition problem, which is, do we count someone who had the coronavirus and died as coronavirus related, or do we have to go fine tune and say, like, well, what else was it? Because we know coronavirus kills people who have other conditions more easily, right? So it's a real challenge. In an earlier talk, I alluded to the idea that it's really hard to count coronavirus infections from people who have already died sometimes, because you might have somebody, wake up, somebody doesn't wake up after going to bed a little sick, and then they might have had a few symptoms, but you test them when the tests are rare. It's a big challenge. So this is sort of the extreme end of that, which is that the hospitals are full. People know the hospitals are full. Medical services are stretched a little bit thin in New York. And so this is the statistic here, okay? If you die at home from the coronavirus, and this article is 2 days old and it's changed, it's been updated already, right? But this was the case. If you die at home from the coronavirus, there's a good chance you won't be included in the official death toll because of a discrepancy in the reporting process. So this is a problem of not even definition, but of measurement, right? The way that we count. So everyone agrees that somebody who has coronavirus and dies and has symptoms from coronavirus and dies should be counted towards a coronavirus death. And then there's argument about, well, what if they died from something else, right? But let's say they die from coronavirus. The way the city was counting it was if you died from coronavirus at home, it didn't count as a coronavirus death. Because how were they measuring it? How could they evaluate it, right? And the point was, ooh, look at these nice T-shirts. I want a T-shirt like that. Okay. Yeah. All right. And so this is about these the issue of accurately counting the scale of the epidemic so that they can have an appropriately scaled public health response. But I'm looking for the here we go. So the fire department said it responded to 2,192 cases of deaths at home between March 20th and April 5th, or about 130 deaths a day. a 400% increase from the same time period last year. So we expect people to die at home, right? And that does happen in a large city. There's fire department shows up and says, oh, someone's died here at home. But 4 times as many deaths per day as what we'd expect means that something else is going on. So the implication here is that probably nothing else killing that many more people besides the one new thing that's killing a lot of people, which is coronavirus. And the argument here is that the count had been, quite a bit higher, and the undercount for coronavirus-related deaths might be as much as 40% of an undercount. It's an interesting claim here, right? Now, the city has said that they are going to address this undercounting and they're going to fix it. That's this part right here after the reporting. So good job, reporters, right? They will now count probable COVID-19 deaths at home as towards the total COVID count. So it'll be interesting to see if that ends up catching up with some of the effects of the death count dropping off in some of these hospitals eventually, and we still see deaths at home, or whether it's all going to quiet down. Nobody knows for sure right now. We'll just cross our fingers and hope it's not more, or as low as possible. All right, that's all for now. That is the end of week 2. I am caught up with that, and I will start week 3 soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.